Hey, what's going on? Happy New Year. Welcome to another episode of AngularAir, our first episode of 2021. Looking forward to it. So let's say hi to our panelists, and then we'll meet our guests, and we'll get into the content as usual. Joining us today, we've got Mike with us. Mike, what's going on?
Happy New Year. Not too much. I want to give you credit, though. Took your time. You thought about it. You were like, 2021. And I like that. I like the attention.
Nice.
And I
You
like
can
the
see
fact
it.
that we are out of 2020, so that's a good thing.
Right. You can see my gears turning, right? I'm like, okay, let me get the date right. Let's see. Okay, good.
It's well-oiled machine. No smoke came out the ears.
Right. Well, that's because I got unplugged with these earbuds. Well, I'm not the only one that like always has this trouble when the year turns to like trying to remember what. I guess it's not so much of a thing anymore. It used to be like when I was writing checks and stuff, but I don't write no checks anymore. So
Writing checks in school. I remember in school it would take me till about February till I would write the correct year on things. On different assignments, but I've been out of school for
a while. Awesome. Our guest joining us back once again, Alex. Alex, how's it going?
Hey, good. How are you?
Doing good. Great to have you back on. What have you been up to?
Lots of things actually. I recently moved from Google to Cisco, so I'm in the new role of principal UI engineer there at Cisco. It's a big move. I've been at Google what feels like forever. You know, that's where I learned a ton. And even was it last 4 years I've been in the part of the Firebase. So I see my Google Home identifies that I said Google the keyword. Yeah, so that was a lot of a lot of interesting things, especially during my time at Firebase, where got to love all the Angular and things like that. So yeah, so it's a very exciting move. Now I'm in a new journey to share everything I learned and basically try to promote those past practices and things like that.
Nice. I see you've got a much bigger office now behind you. I mean, is that all that your space?
It's wide open now too.
Yeah. Open plan, everything.
Yeah, we're actually just yesterday, Ontario entered. I'm Toronto. We are entered in a full lockdown again. Yeah.
And now, have you been working? I mean, you've been working remote this whole time through the pandemic and everything, even when you were doing the Google stuff like that.
Yeah. So ever since March now, I haven't been in the office at all. So, and it continues to be here as well.
Yeah.
How about you?
Same thing. I mean, I've been remote for a long time prior to that, so it was kind of business as usual for me. But yeah, it's interesting, kind of everybody's there. I was talking to somebody, another dev, earlier today in a meeting, and they were saying, well, they've been remote for like 20 years, and they always felt like the odd person out. And now everybody's remote, and they feel like comfortable because like, now the world is like in their world. So interesting.
Yeah, I was part-time remote anyway. Like even at Google for this 7 years, I've been doing like 2 days at home. Because my commute is like over an hour or so one way. So yeah.
Very cool. All right, so we're talking NgRx component store today.
Yep, this is the new thing that's I feel like is getting a lot of traction. Actually, I'm very happy for it. For me, we can. Do you want to start? What do you want to start with? Do you want to start a little bit of story, what it is, how? Because we could do a lot of things there.
Yeah.
What is ComponentStore?
What is ComponentStore? Guess what? It's a state management library. And it's also from NgRx to bring even more confusion.
So it's a state management library from NgRx, but it's not NgRx store.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That's what it is. And it's a library that was created specifically to help more with the local state. if that makes sense.
Well, that's a good point. I think it makes sense. Can you define local? Is that local to a component, local to a module? What's local?
Exactly. Local, I define local is not global. and just to make it, more confusing. So global is globally available in the entire application, and the global means it lives through the life cycle of the application. So NgRx Store, Akita, and NgXS, all these libraries are global, right? They basically live through the entire lifecycle application. But that also means that they're tied to that, right? So if you need some state that's kind of localized within components, you have two ways to do it. Like either you have to push it to the local and to the global one, but in the global sense, like, why do I benefit? Like the entire application doesn't use it. Why I have this thing in the global space, right? It's needed from a local component. When it gets even more trickier is, say I have a number of local components at the same time on the screen, like graphs. Like, you have a number of things at the same time, and now each one needs to push its own data to the global store while it only uses it internally. It could be complex state, right? Like all these moving pieces. But now I need to somehow index them in the global store by some kind of ID, and all of these things are happening for no apparent benefit of the user, right? So that was one of the things that pushed us towards designing this local store. And the other one was in the global, in the global schema, right? Like, talking to each other, having those actions is great. Those are really great for messaging, right? Because you can send it from anywhere, you can consume it anywhere. It's basically your event bus in the system. But once we started getting to the more localized scope, this becomes almost like an additional overhead, right? So that was the second problem that we're trying to solve with the more localized approach. Because in the global one, yes, everything's global. One thing here can trigger 3 effects here, and then if you reducer there. And in the local things, I might want to get that back to the component, that ownership things, and actually invoke a thing, right? And this is one of the beauties of the component store is now I'm using a component store and injecting in the service in my component almost like any other service. So it's almost like I'm interacting with the service. I can read the reactive properties from it, or should I invoke something? Should I start something there, be it effect or updater, which is I call it just like as a method. So those are like the two big differentiator if you're familiar with the global state management at all. So there are obviously more to this, yeah.
So being that it is a part of the overall NgRx ecosystem, is there any dependencies on NgRx, or is it a completely self-standing library?
That's a great question. So it's completely standalone library. Moreover, if you look at the sources, it's basically a single file that has 350 lines of code. So it's tiny. It's super tiny. If you go to the Bundlephobia, and again, I don't want to say exactly. I think it was 2.2 KB at the end, but Bundlephobia. I'll take a look at it.
As you look that up, it's interesting because I always challenge people to, and myself, to think critically about pulling in dependencies, about what are the impacts of pulling in a library to my application. Is it something that I necessarily need a library for? But having such a small footprint, that makes it a lot easier of a decision to say, it's only 2K and probably minification and gzipping or
it's
help.
1.2 KB minified and gzipped, 1.2 KB. So it's slim. And that was on purpose. Almost every single line of code in that library was carefully considered and crafted to be bringing a significant amount of value to the whole thing. So it was highly, and it also being an NgRx library, it's extremely type safe and very strict with types, right? So if you're using the TypeScript in the strictest mode possible, they'll just give you so many benefits and catch so many things before they even get to the compile stage, basically. And UID will help them, with that.
So that brings me to an interesting point. When you so wonderfully answered what does local mean, and you said not global.
Yeah.
At the same time, is there a possibility that if my scope is not global, but is local to anything under the hierarchy of my app root component, could this potentially be a lightweight replacement for NgRx, Akita, NgX?
You're asking a very good question, Mike. So for ComponentStore, we identified 4 main use cases. And one of them is to be, a root scoped service. But it came with a lot of warnings around this, mostly because I know where it would go. I know would we end up having 25 services that are root scoped, and we'll call them component stores. And this is my worry, right? This is why I put the warning signs all over that thing. So you win a lot when you attach ComponentStore to the life cycle of a component itself, because it will auto clean up, it will auto subscribe, it will do so many things for you that you don't have to worry about at all. Like something like even your component gets destroyed, you want things to be cleaned up. You don't want to take until and things like that. So if you attach a service that knows how to clean up to the life cycle of that component, it will automatically take until, stop all the observables, so there's no memory leaks, things like that. And on top of it, it'll So this is where it becomes important. Moreover, if you moved off from one page to another and you no longer need that piece of state and you want to completely clean it up, it was a frequent question in the NgRx global store, like, how do I clean up that state? And now it's like, well, it's auto clean up. It's done. It's done. Now the question comes back, oh, what if I want to bring some of it back? That's a whole different story, right? Maybe you should consider something like global store if that matters, right? If you want that, or there are other ways as well. Yeah. So this is a very good question. Another typical question is, okay, I have my global store and I have this component store. How do I migrate from one to another, or how does it do? And the answer for that is you don't migrate from one to another. Each one of them is really finely good tuned for what it does, right? Moreover, you can have both of them together. And there's a frequent case, for example, what we're doing in Firebase, where we had some global data around the user, around the project they're part of, and all other things, the permissions and things like that, and more, right? That are quite global and used throughout and should be persisted and not through pages, navigations, and things like that. But then we had a bunch of areas where you want to have that state and leave it only through the life cycle of the component. But you would need, for example, something like a user ID and the project number to make a request to the backend to retrieve that temporary data. So you could inject the global store into the component store and retrieve any of that data if you want to, plus the services as well to actually make those requests, right? Because again, services typically should be stateless, and this is something that I promote a lot. I actually ran into the whole conversation: what's a service, what's not a service? And then we realized that we were talking past each other based on the terminology, because frequently in Angular world, anything that's injectable, that's annotated with @injectable, people refer to as service. And some say, oh, that's not the correct way. There are services and there are like cache things, cache entities or something like that are also injectable, but they're not a service. So there's basically terminology, and I highly recommend with the group that you're working with to definitely determine the terminology first, like what do you refer to what. Yeah.
So what in terms of the usage of it and the API of it, is it similar to the NgRx store, or does it have different type of API surface of how you call things like get data from the store or push data into the store?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you were discussing some of the lightweight state things sometime recently. Was it probably a few months ago? And you like the APIs and things like that. So I'm like, hi, you'll definitely love this one then. Let me get to my presentation part so I can quickly go over the APIs. You present in hold on. Let me do the screen share.
Cool. While you're doing that, yeah, one of the things that I think about in terms of, and you talk about it with like what goes in the global store and when you need to like do stuff that's state for that particular component. That's where I kind of see that thing of, I need to persist some state or update, my component with something's loading or something's processing or things like that. And you're like, well, I want to put that in the state so I can select from it. But do I put that in global state? It now couples my component to that global state. And how do you segment that and do that? And it's like a need to be able to do that at this component level. And so it feels like this is that kind of answer for those things that we run into, right?
Yeah, it's definitely the case. And oops, I'm here. Here you go. Do you see my code clearly here?
Yeah, it's a little probably small, but you're in a slide. Is that in a slide? Probably.
It's not blurry or anything, right?
No, it's not blurry. We can
Awesome.
read it.
Yeah, so. Yeah. I can go quickly over the APIs for this thing. And again, and then I'll show you how to use it. It's part of my ComponentStore presentations that I've done in a bunch of conferences the fall of 2020. But this is what I want to show you, like how they implement it inside, and then how the whole thing is. And let me just turn off my notifications first. This is notifications. Do not disturb. Good. All right. So the component store, typically how we would implement it is typically we'll have a state that is responsible for first, identify that. And in this case, this is the, say, cart state interface. So this is the cart store, eventually what it would be, and it will contain the cart items that we're fetching from the backends and things like that. So this is the interface. And the second thing we did here is, so in this case, it's provided in root, but again, remember, this is not the best use cases. In this presentation, I was replacing one of the services that was already there. So that's why I provided in root. But hopefully we don't do this. So you can emit provided in root and then actually use this component store in a specific component. And we can get to that if we'll have time. So then you have a constructor, and again, this is a typical way you provide the services that you would need in the component store, so you'll inject them here, right? And what we do here in the constructor as well, we initialize the state right away. And this is one of the things that we can actually do a bit later. We can do lazy initialization. In this case, just to simplify things, I initialize it right away. So it says that initial one would be, empty. And then this is the interesting part. So we have something called like select methods, and select is a way to read the data from the component store. And we tell, okay, we have this state, right, which was that interface, the entire thing. How do we get, say, cart items out of it? So we have the state, and we can do state.cart items. So this is how we get it. And what's interesting is at this point, and you can probably tell by the $sign, The cart items is not a selector, memoize selector of anything. It's just an observable. So it's an observable of cart items. And this is the important part. So, all right. So let's look at the second one here. I also wanted to extract the cart items count. So cart items is an array of things. I wanted to get the actual number. How many items do I have? You know, there's could be specific products, specific quantities of that product. I want the whole total how many how many products in general I have. So what I can do with the select method is I can provide an observable to it, or actually I can provide a number of observables to it. And then the last thing that I provide, and if you did selectors before, like create selector, you can kind of understand that this is a projector function. So this is the one that would be listening for outputs of all of these observables and pushing it into this function that would do something. I just hid the function because the implementation details doesn't matter. But what it does is, you know, every time this observable emits an array of cart items, it would reduce it to a single number, right? So just reduce array reduce underneath.
Uh-oh.
Frozen? Are you there, Mike?
I am here.
All right. I think we lost Alex for a minute.
Yeah, so by a projector function, when I hear that, I immediately go to, all right, that's map, right? That's a way of taking an input and saying, hey, run it through this function that's going to transform the state to a number. So likely that implementation is likely, what is it, cart items dot length.
Right. Adding them all up and getting the count or whatever. Yeah. Length. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Makes sense. All right. We'll wait for Alex to come back to us, hopefully. The chat's saying it's really cold there. His internet might have froze.
Yeah. And I know that the name says ComponentStore, but this isn't something that you implement directly in your component. It's a way of saying, hey, I want to have this scoped store, meaning scope that it's not global. So this local type store that you can handle. Did he drop out or did you remove?
No, it dropped off. So
okay. Is that you have a way of doing a subset of your application with a shared state. And it looks like it's providing a bunch of structure and methods and implementations to essentially do that without necessarily having to go through with behavior subjects or rolling your own. I don't know how far that goes, meaning I don't know if it's doing similar things to NgRx that does like the memoization that will automatically calculate that, the distinct until changed type stuff as well.
Yeah, that was going to be one of the next things I wanted to ask him about is the selector stuff and the memoization, right, of selecting that data that we get from the NgRx store and store selectors. And I think that like the feeling that I'm getting is, oh, he's coming back. The feeling I'm getting is kind of like this lightweight version, right, of something that then you're not taking on everything, so it still stays lightweight. Hey, Alex.
Hey, I guess I'm back, hopefully.
Nice.
All of a sudden, my connection disappeared. Wow. That was something.
The one thing about the example you were showing there is that I think it's a good quintessential example to show, hey, you may not need a full-blown global state management application to essentially just synchronize the items in a shopping cart. So you have this, like some components that are product details or product list, as well as like, if you think like the Amazon example, you have the shopping cart in the top right, and you add an item there that you get the same information from two different places, or you are interacting with data from two different places, but only one source of truth.
Yes. So yeah, this is one of the important parts, the sources of truth. And this is like the whole few-hour conversation on its own. We can touch on some of the things. about this, because this is really important in the structure. And the component store simplifies things in a bunch of things, but now you have to be a little bit more careful about architecture up front. So you're getting this discount of no actions, but you have to really understand where exactly that state and application lives, because it's no longer in the global scope. It's they can't just throw effects and reducers and be like done with it. You need to understand where that exactly lives, how the state flows. Is there any back ones? Is there some of them? Are there any state, local state? Are there any state that there's a persistent state that you need to sync to other places? It becomes very interesting conversations, for sure. Yeah. So getting back to this APIs slide. So see the cart items and cart items count here. I don't know if we got to this before I lost my Wi-Fi. So you can see we're injecting the store here, the cart store, just like we inject any other service, or injectable to be really broad, right? Any injectable within Angular. And I can just do the .cart items here, and it provides me that observable. So it's reactive, and it works well every time the cart item state gets updated. It will bring us the new observable. If the cart item state has other things that get updated, but not the cart items themselves, we won't get a new value. So this is where the select method becomes really smart. It does all those goodness of distinct until change and share replay. So if you subscribe once, it's sharing the context of it. So it does a lot of the smartness underneath, and it does a take until as well. This is one of the things that I was talking about. Yeah. So this is how we get the data. This is how we read the data. We can also, this is the one.
And really quick on that, like you mentioned here in your example, you have the provided in root, but really what we'd probably do there in that component decorator, we would update the providers array and add our store there. So you're getting a unique instance per component instance, right?
Yeah, the ideally what we do is let's see, like something like this, where we, for example, this is A is part of the state, right? It's one of the components, but we'll be using the components called providers, like cart store here in this case. And it doesn't matter where it's injected. This is the important part. It's where it will be provided. So this is where we're tying it up to the A provider. And A provider component has other components underneath it. And for example, this state, that the same state would need to be used in components C and E. So that's where it's injected, but it's provided in the component A. And this is what I mean by the components called providers, right? So we'll have this providers and cart store. So it'll create the instance of this cart store at the level of A. And it's not unique to the component store. This is generally how component scope providers work within Angular.
Yeah, and to be clear, as we're looking at what you have here on the screen, A is a component, not a module. That's what gives you the tie-in to the life cycle of the component.
Yeah, so I don't even recommend using the module providers anymore. I usually would have services that are either scoped to root or they're scoped to components. I feel this is the best of both worlds, then, kind of thing. Yeah. So okay. So you're just getting back to the APIs part of it. So we got through this one. Okay. So let me.
As you were talking about the read portions there of the exposing those two observables, we had a brief question about the memoization. Are there any type of optimizations that will determine whether or not, or how often this observable will emit or next?
Yes, we do. We do, and this is a good question. Again, select provides you all of this goodness. So it. In this case, our select will only emit the observable when the cart items do change. So say we had many things in the state in the component store responsible for. There should be many, by the way, and that's a whole different other discussion. But should we have like status of loading or other things in there, right? Like that kind of relate to this one. Should those be updated, but cart items do not, this observable will not emit another value, right? So it has inside it has something like distinct until change operator that basically makes sure that you don't get that. And this is actually a good question for other reasons. You frequently, I've been embedded in many different communities during the spring and summer of last year, mostly because I was probing these ideas, right? Because we were developing the component store and we're probing the ideas. We had obviously internal usage within Firebase at that time, but we also were probing all the other use cases, identifying that and ideas, how people definitely feel about the state management. And you hear us say, oh, it's boilerplate, a lot of moving pieces, and I love my own services with behavior subjects. I can do stuff with them like there's no tomorrow. And that's great, right? So I was like, oh, how about this component store, right? We're having this idea, and it would replace your behavior subject with a service. And again, this was the primary target of this demo. That's why you see probably provided in root, because in this presentation, I was actually replacing a service that has a behavior store with a behavior subject inside a service. And I was just showing where the flaws are and how component store can help. So I was asking, like, would you use something like that instead? And the answer was like, not really. I probably can still do all of this stuff myself. What is it? It's nothing else to do. I can throw the distinct until change. I can take until myself and all that. But then you ended up re-implementing this yourself in every single service over and over and over again. And should you forget to do something, you're basically screwing yourself over with there every time re-implementing this. So this one was again, it's a single file, completely independent, highly dense of all the goodness there, right? That basically helps you do all that, and you don't even need to test it. It's well tested and things like that. All right, so this is the right. So that's why, yeah, replacing your own either custom-made implementations or if you are strongly opposing the global state management libraries, you really like your behavior subject in your services, this still be something that you should consider really strongly. All right, so this was the read, and then we have so this is how we read the state. We need also to update the state, obviously, somehow. And in this case, I'm using the private read-only, so it's not used outside of the component store, but you could expose it outside of the component store as well. And this is something called an updater. If you are familiar with the global NgRx, this is basically a case statement within a reducer, if you have an analogy. So that means that, hey, we have some kind of state, and we have a new value that's incoming. In this case, it's cart items. And how can we change the state to update the state in the immutable fashion so that we can update the state? So this is basically how we update the state, when we have this new thing arriving.
So,
yeah.
Real quick question. So the way you're coding this here is very similar to how you manage state in other libraries as well. So my question is immutability as important with Component Store as it is with other state management libraries?
It is because, again, you're trying to optimize for performance. That's why you're using distinct until change. If you are mutating things, the distinct until change won't know that it's a new instance. So it is important. And this goes, NgRx in general, I mean, this is the only state management library used at Google, and even the global one, right? The global store, for the reasons of high performance optimizations. And almost by default, almost all of the Google Angular applications are asked to use on push change detection strategies. So it's highly optimized for the more performant cases, right? Where you need that immutability and you working with this, and there's a deep understanding of the immutability within teams. It's basically on the almost on the complete style guide level of Angular usage to use on push and things like that. So this one goes in line with us as well. Immutability is important. There are actually some wrappers around this component store that use Immer. Tim DeShriver is a big Immer proponent within the NgRx. He's also part of the NgRx team. He actually wrote a quick wrapper, so you can kind of pretend that you're mutating, but internally does all the immutability stuff. This one I'm showing, this a bare bones immutable updater. So this is an updater. And what's interesting with this property, you see this setCartItems property, it's actually a callable property. So you can think of it as a method. And here down there, I highlighted those two usages where I use those updaters. See, I'm calling this setCartItems, and I'm passing CartItems value to it. This is the value that would be passed as a second argument, basically. So from the external user perspective, this feels like a method, right? So if you're trying to test mock-on, it's just a method. Like there's no store dispatch, or there's no that or those type of things, because we don't have actions. So we can call these things directly. And for example, this is another updater, which I don't have an implementation here for, but again, just to show you can update status and error, for example.
And for usage and understanding as people do this, the updater is a synchronous operation?
Updater is a synchronous operation. You could pass the synchronous one. I strongly recommend to use it in a synchronous way only.
Cool.
Yeah, this is a synchronous one. And the final one is an effect. So this is where I kind of recommend to have all the asynchronous stuff. So this is the effect. And if you're familiar with NgRx global store, this, or actually NGXS as well, I think. Effect is nothing new to you. But what the cool part with effect is, again, this is where we can orchestrate a lot of asynchronous things. And this is one of the biggest drawback of the behavior subject approach, because typically the way it's implemented, every time you call a method in the service that has the behavior subject underneath, it will invoke HTTP service right away and push the results in when they're ready. But that means that every invocation, you have very little control how you do this. And again, let me just go over this one so I make it a little bit clear. So this is an effect. And similar to updater, it's responsible for the how we do when we get new values. How do we do when we get new triggers? And in this case, I'm working with observable of strings, IDs. IDs are being kind. So every time somebody wants to add a product, again, this is also a callable property, which again, you can think of method. Add product would appear like a method to the outside of a component store user. And every time we get a new, the method invocation with this new ID, they're basically being pushed in this observable. And now we say, how do we deal with this? Right? In this case, we would use a concat map. That means that every time we get a new ID, we'll wait for the previous one, the inner observable, to complete before we start working with the new one. And this is such an important part of almost any effect. This allows you to control all the race conditions, right? And handle all the, do I want to throw away the new values while I'm still working on the new one, right? Exhaust map. Do I want to stop whatever I'm doing now and use this new ID to do things? This is a switch map. Or do I don't care and I can handle things in parallel? But that's what by default services kind of do when the behavior subject. And then I'll use the merge map. So in this case, I decided, hey, in my business case, I want to be safe and I want to my current one complete before I take the new ID. All right. So that. I take the new ID, I call this cart service add product. And now what do I do with this result? Now, when I have the result, I would do tap. I would, if it's a success, I'll use this updater. Remember that we implemented just a little bit sooner. and I'll push the new value to this. Should it be an error, I'll update status to the error. And lastly, because it's NgRx stream, should there be an error, I should just catch it and not, stop my effect. And what's interesting is that, this was, we're not returning any values past this effect. Effect is basically takes whatever we have here and subscribes to the whole thing, right? So it's not expecting any values. It's just a mechanism to subscribe to it and also prevent effect subscriptions. So that this one's such a frequent way of doing things. We just replaced it with a single operator that basically does this tap and catch error. It's called tap response. And it has two arguments that it takes. First one is a success, and second one is an error. And what I really wanted it to do is error is not an optional. Error, I ask you to handle it. And the reason why I do this is through my years of Angular and and the NgRx and all of this, I see such a common mistake, and one of the biggest mistakes in the applications is just unhandled errors. Because as developers, we're like, yeah, just make it work and we'll handle errors somehow. So that's why here I make it a required argument. I don't want developers to like, oh, I'll do something else later, and then it goes to production and and the users run into this stuff. I want you to handle it. So that's basically the fact. That's how it works. And,
so,
yeah.
Quick question on that. I know we're getting close to time, so I'm going to squeeze in a couple questions. But this question on that real quick. The tap error or the tap, if you can just bring that code back up. Yeah, tap response. So that's just doing a tap behavior. So if we still wanted to swallow the error for some reason at this point, let's say we wanted to redirect them or something, I don't know. We could still need to use a catch error after the tap response, right?
No,
if we wanted to do that, or
no, that would be so. A tap response is exactly this implementation. Basically, it's literally this, right? So here you have tap analyzes the channels. So the next channel would do something, error channel would do something, but tap doesn't handle the error. It just lets it fall through. And catch error actually catches the error and makes it to empty. Empty is a built-in creation operator within NgRx, which means it just does nothing, right? It won't emit a value or nothing, right? So it's empty value. So this prevents error channel propagation. It basically swallows it. So tap response is basically the same thing. If you see the tap response implementation, it's literally exactly that tap plus the catch error, pushing it to dev null. Yeah, and when I said component store is a single file, I kind of was a little there. So it's a single file plus a tap response, which is a separate file. And again, it's 10 lines of code. Plus, we use another custom operator, which we won't have time to talk about today. But again, another 15 lines of code. So still, I consider it a single file. And by the way, here, see the usage of effect. And again, effects are encapsulating the how we treat this. And this is very important because, again, we want to be very opinionated with this. We want to be very structured with this. So we say how. From the user perspective, see we inject this card store here at the bottom. And now it has a method, right, to handle from click or whatever. We pass a single ID string, product ID string. And we just call this at the method, and we pass, see, we're not passing observable, we're passing a single string. And every time somebody calls, it could be this component, it could be other components, calling at the same time, doesn't matter. They are all, whenever they invoke, they're being pushed into this observable. And now we have a way to control the flow. And this is such an important part of any state management. So reading, writing, and handling side effects.
So with effects, are you limited to a single parameter?
With effects, yes, you are limited to a single parameter, but you can pass an object if you want to.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to call out one thing that's really important here that I think is awesome, that I like, is that this effect is returning an observable, right? So when we call it, we'll actually know when that observable is completed, right? Or done, or values come through, right?
No.
So okay,
So this effect, add product
okay.
returns you a void. And this is one of the things that it's a very good question. Thank you for asking it. It's really good. So add product returns. It actually returns you a subscription back, but you can think of it as a void, right? It returns a subscription that you can say there's a factor you run. You can actually stop running this. Stop running if you want to, but you should think of it still as just a signal that you send. So I really wanted to have this push-based architecture, and we still have this interaction where we decouple how we invoke things and how we listen to this. So if you want to listen, you need to use collectors. So this is how you read the data. If you want to update it, you would call with either a fact or updater. And this is really important because you still decouple this. This is still indirection that it's a huge win for a lot of things. If you want to call a service, and get observable right away without any of the things in the middle, well, your services should be just for that XL, but they don't have any state, right? They don't have any state. They don't have any notion of how to coordinate that. Hopefully, yeah. So
that makes sense. So the effect stays as something that's going to be like fire and forget sort of thing.
It's a trigger signal.
Trigger, yeah. And then, but the benefit, I guess, of the other, which is, when you show that the updater to be able to update a thing, you could have your component store class have a method that says do this to update, and in that method, if you needed to, you can encapsulate calls to get stuff and then update your state. And so the need being that like sometimes we have to call stuff and we want to know when it's done doing its work, right? And we don't want to necessarily go the overhead of saying I need to set flags inside of my state to tell me that it's done, right? So it's like you want to be reactive, but sometimes you need to know that like that I asked it to do this work and let me know when it's done so I can just update something.
Yeah, so this is something in my opinion, it's still best to decouple these things. And there are use cases as you describe, and that probably is just, you can just have a simple service call that returns an observable for that without any state things. But why important? It's important to decouple this in the push-based manner, where what you trigger and how you listen this is probably a very good example. If we think of, I know the screen is really small, our cart icon component, for example, that shows the number of items in the cart. All it cares about is that number, and that number being changing, right? So initially it says, hey, service, I'm interested in this data. So it means if nobody fetched it before, it will fetch it, and internally we'll get that state, and icon will know about this. But at the same time, when somebody is adding cards to the item, removes things, purchasing things, all of these things, cart item does not care, and it doesn't want to care about what's happening underneath or which pages are doing. All it cares is that state's changing, so it can listen to this reactive property, right? So this is a first level of interaction, which ComponentStore and behavior subject, actually, this is what it is, both implement. Global store takes a second indirection, which is action, right? So that's basically the layering and then the purpose of it.
Very cool. Very cool.
I like it.
All right, well, we're at the top of the hour, so we probably should wrap up. It sounds like we might need another episode at some point to dive even deeper into this. Yeah, we should plan that, because I getting a taste of all this stuff, I think it's pretty exciting, and I bet a lot of people are interested in pursuing it further.
Yeah, I would like to take a closer look at the API and actually interacting with the API as well.
Yeah, the library itself has been picking up steam really hard. We're at I think 11 to 12,000 downloads weekly, so we're going fast up. But this library is basically the final step in the whole state management picture that I was looking for years, right? We had the global store solution, but it was missing things, I feel, and this one's really fulfilling. And each of them are responsible for its own problems that it solves really, really well. and I was always a proponent to having a minimal logic in the components, no behaviors. Now you can have a basically one-to-one outsourcing of this into the component store in a reactive manner. And this basically allows you to create those beautiful, easy to maintain reactive applications, which I hope people get that vision.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. All right. Well, hey, let's schedule another time. I know we have a pretty booked up for a couple months, so we can do it after that, or we can figure out a day that we can squeeze in an extra episode in a week. So we'll talk and we'll figure something out.
Thanks for having me.
I also know of two guests that we have that would be willing to give up their spot.
Oh yeah, there might be an open spot too. Mike and I we're scheduled to talk on, and we could give that spot up too. All right, hey Alex, thanks a ton for sharing your time, coming on and sharing this content. We, as always, we really appreciate you sharing that time.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Always happy. Thank you for having me.
All right, we look forward to the next time.
All right, take care.
See you, everyone.